I opened the family group chat and froze. Bahamas. My parents, my sister, and her partner, all smiling under the sun while I sat here, expected to feed their pets. My stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from betrayal. I had sacrificed, helped, followed their rules. And this was my reward. My first instinct was anger, but then a plan began to form. What if I didn't just sit here? What if I went somewhere they couldn't touch me? Somewhere I could reclaim every ounce of freedom they had stolen. They thought they controlled me, but they had no idea. I stared at the photos again, as if looking harder might erase them. My parents and my sister, arms wrapped around each other, standing on the sunlit beach of the Bahamas. My name wasn't in the itinerary. No message, no invitation, just a casual assumption that I would stay home, feed their pets, and keep the house running while they disappeared into paradise. My stomach sank, twisting tighter with every laugh in those pictures. How long had I been doing this for them? How many times had I postponed something important for a family favor that barely felt appreciated? I put my phone down, trying to steady my breathing. It wasn't just disappointment, it was betrayal. A sharp, stinging kind that makes you question every little thing you thought you knew about the people you love. I remembered last Christmas, how I stayed up late baking cookies for them, how I had rearranged my work schedule for my sister's recital, how I had driven miles to help my father with some last-minute errands, and now they assumed my loyalty as a constant, unquestioned, and utterly invisible. They think I'll just sit here and do nothing. But what if I don't? I whispered under my breath, barely audible. It wasn't revenge that formed immediately. It was the first spark of defiance. I clenched my fists and thought of the tiny victories that could belong to me alone. Perhaps the Bahamas trip wasn't lost. Perhaps it had just shifted. The idea felt dangerous, thrilling, almost forbidden. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring at the gray drizzle outside. The weather matched my mood, muted, cold, and uncomfortable. But it was also quiet enough for me to think. I could scream at them, confront them, force their attention, but I knew that wouldn't satisfy me. This had to be subtle, smart, strategic. A quiet reclaiming of something I had been losing without realizing it. I glanced over at the cat, sleeping on the couch, fluffy, content, oblivious to family politics. I smiled faintly. If they expected me to spend the next week here, dutifully feeding pets and answering frantic messages, they had underestimated me. They didn't know how I could bend a situation to my will without anyone noticing. I didn't want to make them angry, not yet. That would be too obvious. The thrill lay in secrecy, in planning behind the scenes while everyone assumed I was compliant. Scrolling through travel websites, I found a villa in Greece. Pictures of sunlit terraces, quiet beaches, a small balcony with a view of the sparkling sea. My pulse quickened. It was expensive enough to feel like a reward, cheap enough that I could afford it, without anyone noticing withdrawals or suspicious bank activity. Every click, every detail made me feel alive again. This was a world where I could be free, where my choices belonged only to me. I opened a new document and began to jot down potential dates, flights, and activities. Each line was like a tiny rebellion, a silent "I will not be controlled," written in neat, careful letters. I laughed softly, a sound that surprised me. It was the first time in hours that I felt real joy, not tinged with bitterness. My parents assumed my resentment would be passive, invisible, unthreatening. They didn't know that the quietest people often make the most calculated decisions. But I also had to play my role at home. When my mother called to confirm my duties with the pets, I smiled, voice sweet, reassuring. "Of course, Mom, I'll take care of everything," I said. She sounded satisfied, her tone dripping with the ease of someone who assumes dominance. I felt a shiver of satisfaction. They had no idea that my thoughts were already halfway across the ocean, imagining turquoise waters and sunsets far from their control. Even as I arranged for meals and checked on the pets, I kept scribbling in the margins of my document. Flights booked secretly. Best time for villa check-in. Must not leave trace in email. Each tiny note was a step away from obligation and toward liberation. A microplan forming within the confines of my ordinary life, yet so powerful in its potential impact. I could almost see it, me stepping off the plane in Greece, suitcase in hand, breathing in air that belonged only to me. The more I imagined it, the more daring my thoughts became. What if I posted subtle hints on social media while they were away? Just small glimpses, nothing direct, just enough to make them wonder where I had gone. Would they guess it? Would they even think of it? The power of invisibility fascinated me. I didn't need confrontation to make my point. My absence and quiet autonomy could speak louder than anger ever could. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the gray sky with streaks of orange, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Shock, betrayal, anticipation, and excitement, all mingling in a wave that left me both tense and strangely exhilarated. I had a plan, a secret, a future that belonged to me and only me. They assumed they had control over the week, over my time, over my energy. They were wrong. I made one last note in my document. They think I'm just going to sit here, wait and see. A smile crept over my face, soft but firm, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the obedient daughter. I was Emily, fully and completely, thinking, planning, and reclaiming what had always been mine. Even as I went to bed that night, the house quiet except for the rhythmic breathing of the pets, I couldn't stop imagining the turquoise water of the Greek coast, the sun warm on my shoulders, the thrill of freedom. The night felt alive with possibility. I drifted off with one thought echoing in my mind. They have no idea what's coming. The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of purpose, as if the world had shifted while I slept. The house was quiet, the pets still dozing in their corners, and I had a clear path ahead. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and started searching for flights, villas, anything that would mark the beginning of my escape. Greece. The thought alone made my chest tighten with anticipation. Sunlight glinting off the Aegean Sea, small cobblestone streets lined with cafes, a villa just steps from the shore. I could almost feel the warmth on my skin. Clicking through listings, I weighed options carefully. Privacy was paramount. I couldn't have any trace of my plans floating in family emails or shared accounts. Finally, I settled on a villa with a small balcony overlooking the water, a local kitchen for cooking, and a private pool tucked behind a high wall. It felt perfect, a tiny fortress where I could breathe without interruption. I booked the flight, secured the villa, and even scheduled a few guided experiences, snorkeling trips, small island tours. Each decision was a thread weaving me back into a life that belonged entirely to me. Yet I didn't want to make my absence obvious. I kept a few tantalizing hints on social media, carefully crafted. A post here, a subtle story there, nothing explicit. Just enough to make my parents pause and wonder if I was somewhere more exciting than my duties at home. It was a delicate balance, teasing without revealing, manipulating perception without confrontation. The thrill of it coursed through me like caffeine. Every click, every carefully phrased caption was a small rebellion disguised as innocuous content. As I jotted down the schedule for the next week, I reminded myself to stay calm and efficient at home. The pets needed feeding, the plants watered, the house orderly. I could do all of this while quietly planning my liberation, so I poured myself a second cup of coffee and moved through the motions with exaggerated care, humming under my breath to mask the amusement curling at the edges of my mind. My mother had called earlier, confirming her expectations for the week. I'd assured her everything was under control, voice bright, tone sweet. She believed me, blissfully unaware that the real control had already shifted. While feeding the cat, I noticed a small spill of kibble on the floor. Instead of cleaning it immediately, I left a tiny trail, subtle enough that it could be dismissed as accident, yet noticeable enough to make any conscientious parent tense. The dog's water bowl had a slight smear along the edge, the bedspread slightly rumpled from a previous nap. These were minor things, inconsequential to anyone else, but they held weight in the minds of those who demanded perfection. I moved through the house with the pets, subtly rearranging a cushion here, a toy there, like a painter leaving intentional brush strokes. It was a silent game of perception, one I was thoroughly enjoying. Between tasks, I checked my messages, making small polite replies to my family's inquiries. Yes, the dog has eaten. The cat is fine. No problem with the litter box, I typed. Nothing alarming, nothing overt, just enough consistency to lull them into a false sense of security while leaving little seeds of doubt. Each careful interaction was a reminder that I wasn't just complying. I was orchestrating a situation that allowed me freedom without chaos. By afternoon, I had compiled a list of experiences I wanted to enjoy in Greece, tiny indulgences to mark this week as my reclamation. A morning walk along a quiet harbor, coffee in the sun, while journaling thoughts without interruption, exploring narrow streets filled with colors and smells foreign to my usual life. I imagined myself there, each activity a step further from the weight of expectation pressing down at home. Even the thought of it brought a lightness to my chest, a quiet laughter that I could barely suppress. While sipping a late afternoon tea, I glanced around the house. Everything was superficially in order, yet the subtle traces of my mini interventions were like tiny flags of rebellion. They would notice, eventually, but by the time they pieced together the patterns, I would already be far away, feeling the sun on my shoulders instead of the eyes of an audience. The thought made me grin. I had created a delicate tension, a slow unraveling that worked in my favor. Evening came, and with it, the ritual of dinner preparation. I cooked efficiently, plated neatly, and arranged the table with care. Yet a minor misalignment here, a napkin slightly off-center there, small, almost unnoticeable things. Each a breadcrumb of subtle defiance. The family might never consciously register it, or they might, sending a pang of tension through their minds without understanding why. Micro cliffhanger accomplished. The thought gave me a small thrill, and I leaned back with a sigh. enjoying the quiet of my secret victory. Later, as I curled up with a book, the pets settling around me, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. This week would belong to me, not to anyone else. I could laugh, breathe, and feel alive in ways I hadn't in months, maybe years. I was still present at home, still fulfilling obligations, but every movement, every small choice was mine. The empowerment was intoxicating, but tempered by calm and subtlety. I wasn't a cold warrior seeking revenge. I was a tactician, a strategist, reclaiming a life that had been quietly constrained. Before sleep, I reviewed my itinerary one last time, making minor adjustments. My mind raced with possibilities. Little adventures, quiet breakfasts on the balcony, long walks where no one could judge my pace, my choices, my freedom. I felt a swell of pride and satisfaction. Micro cliffhanger. They might sense a shift, a subtle unease, and it would only enhance my triumph. I drifted off, the hum of the house mingling with the gentle thrill of anticipation. Knowing the week ahead held promise, empowerment, and a quiet, undeniable victory that no one could touch. The morning of their departure arrived, and the house was buzzing with energy, though none of it belonged to me. My parents moved through the motions of packing with an exaggerated sense of purpose. My sister checking her phone constantly for itinerary updates. I smiled, nodded, and offered cheerful assistance while quietly savoring the secret knowledge that this week was no longer theirs to dictate. Every casual exchange, every bright "have fun" I offered, was a mask for the freedom I was about to embrace. They assumed compliance. I held liberation. As they loaded suitcases into the car, I maintained my practiced calm. I checked the pets' water and food one last time, ensuring everything appeared orderly, yet just enough left slightly askew to spark subconscious concern. The parents waved, oblivious to the quiet subversion in every small choice I had made. "Have fun feeding them," my father called cheerfully. Not noticing the faint smirk that tugged at my lips, I waved goodbye, hiding the surge of excitement bubbling inside me. The drive to the airport felt surreal. I watched them disappear into the distance, imagining the beaches, the cocktails, the sun-kissed smiles, and I allowed myself a brief private thrill. I wasn't angry anymore. That emotion had shifted into anticipation, a soft electric current that ran beneath my skin. The world was mine, temporarily, quietly, and I had planned every small step to savor it fully. On the plane, the moment I buckled in, I let my shoulders relax for the first time in days. The hum of the engines, the soft murmur of other passengers, the slight turbulence, it all felt like a lullaby, signaling the beginning of a personal adventure. I gazed out the window, watching clouds drift lazily against the pale morning sky, and imagined the turquoise waves of the Aegean Sea stretching endlessly below me. The sheer possibility of choice, of self-direction, made my chest swell. I reached for my phone, carefully composing a micro hint for social media. A sunlit balcony from a previous trip, paired with a vague caption. Sometimes the best views are the ones no one expects you to see. Nothing explicit, nothing that would give away my current plans, but just enough to make my family pause. My pulse quickened as I imagined them scrolling through it, uncertainty flickering across their faces as they wondered, where is she really? It was playful, teasing, and entirely mine. The thrill of this subtle twist danced through me. By mid-flight, I pulled out my travel journal, sketching out the first steps of my Greek escape. Small notes, reminders for excursions, quiet moments I wanted to savor alone. I imagined walking through narrow streets lined with pastel houses, breathing in unfamiliar aromas, hearing the chatter of locals in a language foreign yet melodic. Each detail heightened the sense of liberation. My anticipation was tempered by calm, measured planning. Every idea, every minor excitement, was a brushstroke painting the canvas of my personal freedom. Landing in Athens, I felt a rush of exhilaration. The airport was bustling, warm Mediterranean air brushing against my face. As I stepped outside, I checked my messages quickly, noting the flurry of texts from my parents. "How's the dog? Are you sure the cat is okay? Did you feed them already?" I read each one, smiling faintly. They had begun to sense the tiny cracks I had engineered, and it was perfectly timed. I typed back short, calm reassurances, never raising alarm, never revealing that I had already orchestrated a minor crisis with the pets to make them tense without real harm. The taxi ride to the villa was a blur of excitement and planning. I pressed my face to the window, watching the sun glint off whitewashed buildings and sparkling water. Each turn of the wheels felt like a departure, not just from home, but from the expectations, the subtle control, the unspoken rules that had kept me confined. I smiled quietly, savoring the lightness of being untethered, the thrill of anticipation building with every passing mile. Arriving at the villa, I exhaled deeply, stepping into a space that smelled faintly of salt and warmth, entirely my own. I unlocked the balcony doors, letting sunlight spill across the floor, and imagined spending days here, fully immersed in a rhythm of my choosing. The first sip of coffee on the terrace, the sound of waves lapping the shore, the gentle rustle of leaves, it was intoxicating. I had planned for freedom, and now I was tasting it in full. Yet even in this paradise, the pets were never far from my mind. I had orchestrated a subtle crisis, a tipped-over food bowl, a slightly misplaced toy, a minor mess that was noticeable but harmless. I had anticipated that the flurry of notifications from my parents would follow, and I was not wrong. My phone buzzed incessantly with questions and panic-laden texts. I responded with calm brevity, managing the situation from afar, each reply measured to maintain tension without causing actual distress. Micro cliffhanger executed flawlessly. They had no idea how controlled everything was. As evening descended, I sat on the balcony with a journal, the sky painted in shades of rose and gold. My pulse slowly returned to a steady rhythm, the micro-crisis at home serving only to enhance my private thrill. Each message answered with precision, each hint left on social media, each small worry they experienced. They were my silent witnesses, unaware of the careful orchestration behind every calm word I wrote. By nightfall, the villa was quiet, the ocean murmuring softly in the background, and I allowed myself to stretch fully, chest lifted, shoulders relaxed. I had crossed the threshold from obligation to autonomy. The day had been a symphony of subtle victories and liberation, each note resonating with quiet joy, anticipation, and a sense of satisfaction that warmed me deeper than the Greek sun ever could. As I finally set my phone aside and leaned back on the balcony chair, the weight of the day lifted entirely. I could almost feel the ripple of tension back home, their anxiety mingling unknowingly with my calm contentment. I closed my eyes, inhaling the salty breeze, and whispered to myself, "This is only the beginning. The morning air smelled of salt and warmth as I stepped out onto the terrace, the villa bathed in soft sunlight. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the way it warmed my hands and lingered on my tongue. Outside, the waves lapped lazily against the shore, a rhythm that seemed almost meditative. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely untethered. Every responsibility, every expectation, every tiny control from home had dissolved into the turquoise sea, stretching endlessly before me. I decided to start the day exploring a nearby village, winding through cobblestone streets that twisted unpredictably between pastel-colored houses. The aroma of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans mingled in the air, teasing my senses as I wandered from shop to shop, tasting small bites, sampling tiny cups of coffee poured with care by elderly locals who smiled at my hesitant attempts at Greek. I felt alive in a way I hadn't realized I had been missing, a sense of possibility that stretched in every direction. Even as I reveled in freedom, a subtle thrill ran beneath my enjoyment. I posted a vague photo on social media, a sunlit alleyway with shadows stretching long in the afternoon, captioned simply, "Found a quiet corner no one expects." Nothing revealing, nothing specific, but I imagined my family scrolling, curiosity and unease flickering across their minds. I smiled faintly, sipping my drink, knowing they would read between the lines, piecing together a reality they couldn't yet grasp. Micro-clues were my silent game, a strategic dance between presence and absence, freedom and control. By noon, I found a small taverna perched above the water, where I ordered grilled fish and local vegetables, enjoying the sunlight on my shoulders. The rhythm of the day felt intoxicating, each moment a layer of experience I could call solely my own. I allowed myself to slow down, observing the locals' interactions, listening to their melodic language, and feeling a sense of belonging that wasn't tied to anyone else's rules. Joy and contentment wove together, lifting me into a gentle excitement that made the earlier tension at home feel almost dreamlike. Between bites, I checked my phone. True to expectation, messages from my parents were frequent, frantic, increasingly concerned over the minor disturbances I had engineered with the pets. I answered with calm precision, carefully measuring my words. "Everything is fine. The dog is happy. The cat is settling down," I typed, each sentence a thread in a tapestry of control they could not fully read. Every response maintained a careful balance, reassurance paired with just enough ambiguity to keep their anxiety simmering. The tension of micro-manipulation thrilled me, and I leaned back, letting the Mediterranean sun wash over my skin as I considered the subtle power of influence without confrontation. Later, I wandered down to a secluded beach, the sand soft beneath my bare feet, the water cold but invigorating as it lapped against my ankles. The freedom to move, to choose my path without expectation or oversight, was intoxicating. I dipped further into the waves, letting them pull me gently, imagining the look on my parents' faces if they knew I was here, truly alone and unbound. The thrill was quiet, intellectual, satisfying in ways that simple rebellion could never match. Each step on the sand was a reclamation of agency, a silent declaration of autonomy. I returned to the villa in the late afternoon, letting the sun dry my skin and warm my shoulders. A small ping on my phone notified me of a message from the neighbor who had been checking in on the pets as arranged. I read carefully. The cat had knocked over a small bowl. The dog had found a new hiding spot in the house. Nothing serious, just minor chaos that would trigger small waves of concern from my parents once they read the updates. I responded with warmth and subtle humor. "Thanks for the updates. They're behaving beautifully as always. Nothing to worry about." The messages reassured the neighbor while keeping my family guessing. A delicate balance I had perfected over the last few days. As evening approached, I cooked a light meal on the villa's small kitchen stove, enjoying the sound of water simmering and the gentle clink of utensils. I allowed myself to pause and reflect, thinking about the weeks leading up to this moment. The early shock, the sting of exclusion, the quiet planning, it had all led here. Every micro cliffhanger, every subtle clue I had left behind, every minor crisis with the pets, was now part of a layered strategy that gave me control without confrontation. I wasn't angry or vengeful. I was intelligent, precise, and above all, free. After dinner, I settled on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. The ocean shimmered like molten glass, and I let the day's excitement ebb into calm reflection. I considered the messages from home, imagining my parents reading them and feeling the quiet ripple of unease I had engineered. They couldn't see me, couldn't control me, yet I influenced their thoughts without anger, without aggression. It was subtle, clever, and profoundly satisfying. As the stars appeared above, I closed my eyes and inhaled the scent of salt and pine. The villa, the sea, the quiet power I held over both my freedom and the perception of my family. It was intoxicating. I had orchestrated a delicate equilibrium, a web of influence and subtle control, all while fully immersing myself in the pleasure of new experiences. I felt clever, accomplished, and most importantly, entirely alive. Before sleep, I wrote in my journal, capturing the sensory details, the minor victories, and the exhilaration of freedom. I ended the entry with a simple thought. They may think they know what I'm doing, but they have no idea. Every step, every choice, every moment belongs to me. The micro twist of the day, the clever manipulation of perceptions, had left them uneasy and me exhilarated. I drifted to sleep with a soft smile, the rhythm of the ocean beneath me echoing the gentle thrill of control, independence, and triumph. I had been in Greece for nearly a week when the messages from home slowed, a subtle sign that my tiny orchestrations were starting to unsettle my parents. Their initial confidence, the assumption that I was simply watching pets and keeping the house in order, was beginning to erode. My little micro-clues, combined with carefully timed social media hints, had planted seeds of uncertainty. I felt a small private thrill, knowing they were starting to notice the absence I had created. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, my parents' Bahamas trip wasn't going as smoothly as they had envisioned. The sun, while glorious, had decided to hide behind clouds for most of the morning, leaving damp sand and a chill that no amount of sunscreen could fix. Their hotel had double-booked a suite, forcing them to shift rooms multiple times. Minor mishaps escalated, a lost luggage mix-up, a delayed boat tour, and a restaurant serving the wrong dish after they had made reservations months in advance. Alone, these inconveniences would have been trivial, but with the invisible variable of my absence, the weight felt heavier. I imagined my mother glancing at her phone, expecting updates from me about the pets, only to find brief, calm responses that revealed nothing. "Everything is fine, don't worry," I would write. I could picture her furrowing her brow, the creeping realization that her daughter was thriving in a world far from her control. A micro cliffhanger lingered in my mind. How long before they started wondering why I wasn't anxiously checking in, why I seemed so completely self-sufficient? It was a small, simmering tension, one that made me feel both clever and satisfied. Back in the villa, I allowed myself to lean into reflection. I thought about the subtle shift that had been occurring. For the first time, my parents were being forced to acknowledge the value I brought into their lives, not through lectures, not through protests, but through absence, autonomy, and quiet competence. It was almost poetic. The very thing they assumed would render me powerless had become the instrument of their growing awareness. I smiled to myself, sipping coffee as sunlight danced across the terrace floor. Each day in Greece, I added to my list of tiny micro-clues for social media: a photograph of a sun-drenched balcony, a casual post about a market I stumbled upon, a subtle note in a story about a morning swim. Nothing explicit, but enough for my parents to notice, to feel the faint pangs of curiosity and unease. They began to wonder silently, why was I not just there, dutifully following instructions? Why did I seem so composed, so full of life, while they wrestled with unexpected mishaps? The micro cliffhanger played out perfectly, an invisible tension that required no confrontation. Finally, the week drew to a close. My return flight home felt like the culmination of a carefully executed plan. The villa, the turquoise waters, the quiet streets of small Greek towns, they all faded behind me as the plane lifted. And yet the memory of freedom remained vividly imprinted in my mind. I imagined my parents' faces when they saw me return, curious, cautious, perhaps even a little apprehensive. The anticipation made my pulse quicken with a sense of triumph that was gentle, subtle, and completely deserved. Stepping off the plane, I breathed deeply, savoring the familiar scents and sounds of home, while carrying the freshness of the Greek air in my chest. I entered the house and was immediately greeted by a mixture of relief and quiet surprise from my parents. Their expressions flickered between recognition and acknowledgement, the unspoken realization of how much they had underestimated me, evident in the way they studied my movements. I smiled softly, saying nothing, letting them experience the subtle weight of their own misjudgment. The pets were excited but orderly, a testament to my careful planning. I allowed them to greet me fully before moving through the house, checking that everything was in place. I spoke calmly, answered questions with warmth and precision, never pointing out their earlier assumptions or mistakes. The quiet triumph lay not in confrontation, but in letting them see, in real time, that my absence had been neither chaos nor failure, but a period of self-empowerment and strategic autonomy. I could sense my mother's thoughts drifting, a mix of guilt and admiration, as she realized that her controlling behavior had not only been unnecessary, but counterproductive. My father's quiet glances carried an acknowledgement of their misjudgment, tempered with the awareness that their daughter was not to be taken for granted. I didn't need to say a word. The lessons were unfolding organically, naturally, without rancor or spectacle. That evening, as I sat by the kitchen window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I reflected on the week's events, the micro-manipulations, the hints, the subtle crises. They had all contributed to this quiet crescendo. My parents were beginning to understand not only my value, but my independence, and I had achieved it without a single argument or raised voice. The layers of the plan had worked perfectly. They had felt tension, concern, and uncertainty, and had now arrived at the threshold of recognition and subtle regret. I poured a glass of wine and toasted silently to myself, savoring the satisfaction that came not from revenge, but from intelligence, foresight, and patience. The thrill was tempered by calm, a sense of serenity that came from knowing I had orchestrated a scenario where they could learn the lesson on their own. No yelling, no confrontation, just the quiet realization that their control had limits, and that I had exceeded them with grace. Finally, I allowed the emotional tension to ebb entirely, settling into a warm glow of satisfaction. I had been excluded, underestimated, and assumed powerless. Yet through careful planning, subtle manipulation, and the deliberate assertion of my freedom, I had reclaimed my agency and taught a quiet, unforgettable lesson. My parents' faces, thoughtful, tentative, and tinged with self-awareness, were proof enough. The week of liberation and strategy had not only brought me joy and autonomy, but had also reshaped the perception they held of me. Without a single word of confrontation, the house had settled into an unusual quiet after my return, a calm punctuated by subtle adjustments in the way my parents moved, spoke, and even glanced at me. There was no tension, no overt confrontation, only the faintest shift in their behavior that suggested recognition and respect. I moved through the rooms, tidying lightly, attending to the pets, but the weight I had carried for years, the unspoken expectations, the subtle control, the constant need to please, felt lighter, almost lifted. Sitting in the living room that evening, I allowed myself to reflect on the past weeks. The shock of exclusion, the initial sting of betrayal, the thrill of secretly planning a solo adventure, and the careful manipulations I had orchestrated. All of it came together as a single thread of empowerment. I realized that what I had gained was more than just a week in Greece or a clever victory over minor family assumptions. I had discovered my ability to set boundaries, to protect my time and energy, and to act in alignment with my desires without needing validation from anyone else. Memories surfaced, fleeting and vivid. Family dinners where my opinions were overlooked, small sacrifices I had made that went unnoticed, moments when I had smiled politely while my desires were sidelined. But the bitterness that once accompanied these memories had softened. I could see them now for what they were, pieces of a puzzle that had shaped me, taught me patience, resilience, and strategic thinking. Instead of resentment, I felt compassion and understanding, not for their actions, but for their limitations and the ways they had unconsciously constrained me. I glanced at the pets curling quietly beside me, their presence grounding me. Even in their simplicity, they were reminders of the small, subtle responsibilities that I could manage with grace, while still claiming ownership over my life. Each minor interaction I had orchestrated, the messages, the hints, the controlled crises, had been a lesson in self-determination. I realized that freedom didn't require rebellion. It required precision, awareness, and emotional intelligence. The thrill of power lay not in domination, but in subtle control over my own life. A faint smile crossed my lips as I imagined the expressions on my parents' faces. During the week I was away, confusion, minor panic, and perhaps the first hints of respect. It was satisfying, yes, but it was not about revenge. The lesson had been imparted naturally, without conflict, and that made it infinitely more powerful. They had begun to see me as an independent, capable adult, not just the obedient daughter who would silently bend to their will. The weight of their assumptions had lifted, and in its place was a tentative acknowledgement that I deserved autonomy. I allowed myself a moment of pause, breathing deeply, feeling the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. The day had been long, but the sense of calm that accompanied self-empowerment was profound. I reflected on the subtle micro-clues, the strategic hints, and the careful manipulation of perception. Everything had been carefully balanced: control without aggression, visibility without exposure, influence without conflict. This awareness brought a quiet satisfaction, a validation of not only my actions, but my growth as a person, capable of navigating complex emotional landscapes with intelligence and grace. Yet even as I basked in this newfound understanding, I felt a subtle stirring of curiosity. Life was full of paths I hadn't yet explored, experiences I hadn't yet claimed. The week in Greece had been a microcosm of what freedom could feel like, but the horizon stretched far beyond it. I realized that this was only the beginning. Small micro-cliffhangers whispered in my mind. What if I traveled alone for months? What if I immersed myself in cultures I barely understood? What if I let the world teach me more about who I could be? The possibilities felt limitless, and that realization was intoxicating. In the days that followed, the subtle shift in family dynamics became increasingly evident. My parents no longer assumed I would accommodate every whim or demand. They asked politely, respected my time, and deferred to my judgment more often than not. My sister's casual teasing had softened, replaced by genuine curiosity about my experiences. Each interaction reinforced the balance I had achieved: autonomy without alienation, control without confrontation, growth without bitterness. I moved through these moments with grace, aware of the quiet victories in every exchange. Sitting once more on the terrace in the late afternoon, watching sunlight shimmer across the backyard, I allowed myself to dream. I envisioned new adventures, small and large, weekend escapes to nearby towns, long journeys abroad, simple mornings spent journaling with coffee in hand, afternoons spent learning new skills, evenings sharing experiences with friends or family on my own terms. Each vision was a thread of possibility, a testament to the life I could now fully claim for myself. The emotional rhythm of the day, of the week, and indeed the past month, the shock, the tension, the subtle manipulations, the joy of autonomy, the quiet triumphs, settled into a gentle cadence. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a journey completed and the anticipation of new paths ahead. The balance of calm reflection and excitement for the future was a gentle oscillation, a sinuous rhythm that carried me forward with both contentment and eager expectation. Before I went to bed, I wrote one final note in my journal. This is only the beginning. There is a whole world waiting, and I am ready to explore it on my terms. The words carried both a promise and a reminder. My freedom was hard-earned, carefully orchestrated, and entirely mine. My parents had begun to understand, the household had adjusted, and I had reclaimed not only my space, but my sense of self. The night settled quietly around the house, the pets resting at my feet, the stars glowing faintly through the windows. I lay back and let my mind wander, imagining the adventures, the challenges and the joys that awaited. The future felt expansive, limitless, and entirely within my grasp. I drifted to sleep with a sense of fulfillment, empowerment, and quiet excitement, knowing that the lessons of the past weeks had prepared me for a life defined by autonomy, intelligence, and joy.